She was 21 years old when she was told, quite plainly, that she was of no more use to the house than the dust that gathered on its windowsills. The words had come from her uncle, spoken across a breakfast table set with silver that had not been polished in months, and they had landed on her like a verdict rather than an opinion. Behind him, through tall rain-streaked windows, the gardens of Ashcombe Hall stretched grey and neglected into the mist, and somewhere above them, in a wing no one had entered in a generation, a library sat locked behind a door of dark oak, a room her uncle had just called, with a dismissive wave of his hand, that old library nobody wants. She would remember that sentence for the rest of her life. Not because it wounded her, though it did, but because it was, without either of them knowing it, the first thread of a truth that would one day unmake everything her uncle believed he owned. Before we go further into her story, if you find yourself drawn into these old English halls of secrets, letters, and inheritance, take a moment now to press subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of forgotten aristocratic history, and in the comments below, tell me where in the world you are watching this from tonight. I read every single one, and it warms this old story to know how far it travels. Her name was Margaret Eleanor Ashworth, niece by marriage to His Grace, the Duke of Rothermere. And for 3 years she had lived at Ashcombe Hall, not as family, but as a guest whose welcome had long since worn thin. She did not know, in that quiet, humiliating breakfast, that within the very room he had just dismissed lay letters that could unravel the entire line of succession, could name, in ink faded but legible, an heir the family had spent 2 decades pretending never existed. She did not know it yet, but she would. Margaret had come to Ashcombe Hall the way so many young women of reduced fortune came to grand houses in those days, not through invitation, but through necessity. Her father, a country clergyman of modest means, had died when she was 19, leaving her with little beyond his books, his good name, and a letter of introduction to a duke he had once served as a young curate. Her mother had died years before that, in childbirth, and so it was that Margaret arrived at the towering iron gates of Ashcombe with a single trunk, a mourning dress gone slightly grey from washing, and no expectations whatsoever. She was not, strictly speaking, entitled to anything. The Duke's late wife had been a distant cousin of her father's, a connection so thin that most of the household staff were uncertain, in the beginning, whether to call her Miss or cousin or simply the girl. The Duke himself, a tall silver-templed man named Charles Ashworth, 7th Duke of Rothermere, had taken her in with the air of a man performing a duty rather than an act of affection. He was not unkind, but he was not warm either, and in the 3 years she had lived beneath his roof, she had learnt the particular loneliness of being tolerated rather than loved. It was his younger brother, Edmund, who made her days difficult. Edmund Ashworth had spent his life in the shadow of a title he would never hold, and that shadow had curdled something in him. He managed the estate's finances, or claimed to, and it was Edmund who had first suggested, quietly, at a family dinner some months prior, that the girl ought to consider a more modest arrangement. A cottage, perhaps, somewhere she could be comfortable without straining the estate's resources. He said it kindly, in front of witnesses. In the particular way cruel men learn to disguise cruelty as concern. She did not know then that Edmund's concern for the estate's resources had very little to do with her, and a great deal to do with a debt of nearly £11,000 he had accumulated at the gaming tables of London. A debt he had been quietly, desperately trying to settle using funds that were not, strictly speaking, his to spend. Nor did she know that the Duke himself was dying. He had told no one but his physician. A weakness in the chest, the doctor called it, though what he meant, in the plain language neither of them used, was that the Duke of Rothermere had perhaps a year left to him, and no living son to inherit his title or his lands. This was the fact upon which the entire household silently turned, like a wheel no one spoke of, but everyone felt beneath their feet. Without a son, the dukedom would pass to Edmund, a man whose gambling debts and cold ambitions were, to those who knew him well, a source of quiet dread. The servants whispered of it in the kitchens. The distant cousins wrote careful, probing letters. And Margaret, who understood by now that she occupied no real place in this succession, simply watched, and waited, and tried to make herself small enough not to be a burden. She had learned in 3 years the particular geography of a house that did not want her. She knew which corridors to avoid at which hours, so as not to encounter Edmund in a mood for cruelty disguised as wit. She knew that the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, softened toward her only in the kitchen, over tea, when no one from the family was near enough to overhear kindness being offered to the girl. She knew, above all, the particular ache of formal dinners, of sitting at a table gleaming with silver and candlelight, surrounded by conversation that never quite included her, watching the rain streak down tall windows while lords and ladies discussed a season she would not be attending, a London she would never be presented to, a future that did not, in any of their imaginings, contain her. She had grown skilled, in that time, at swallowing her own feelings whole, at nodding pleasantly when Edmund made some remark about guests who overstay their welcome, at retreating to her small chamber afterward to sit by a cold grate and remind herself that dignity, at least, could not be taken from her, even when everything else had been. It was a lonely kind of strength, the strength of a young woman with no allies and no fortune, and she wore it, that autumn, like a coat 2 sizes too thin for the weather. She did not know then that she was, in fact, the very centre of the question everyone else was too afraid to ask aloud. The east wing of Ashcombe Hall had been closed for as long as Margaret had lived there. It was not spoken of directly, servants referred to it only as the old rooms, and even the Duke, when his path happened to take him near the sealed corridor, would quicken his step, as though the very air of that wing carried something he did not wish to breathe. Margaret had asked about it once, in her first year, and had been met with such a sharp silence from the housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, that she never asked again. But dust does not respect silence, and old houses do not keep their secrets as well as their masters believe. It happened on a wet October afternoon, when a storm had knocked a branch through one of the east wing's upper windows, and Mrs. Pruitt, too rheumatic in the knees to climb the stairs herself, asked Margaret to see that the broken glass was swept and the rain kept from ruining the floors below. It was, Mrs. Pruitt said, nothing but an old library nobody wants, Edmund's very phrase, passed down through the household like a piece of received wisdom no one thought to question. Margaret expected dust. She expected mice, perhaps, and the smell of old paper gone soft with damp. She did not expect what she found. The library itself was vast, 2 full stories of shelving, connected by a spiral iron staircase, every shelf crowded with volumes bound in cracked leather. Dust lay thick, as felt across every surface, disturbed only by the fresh trail of rain, now dripping steadily through the shattered pane above. A portrait hung crookedly near the fireplace, a young man she did not recognize, his fair hair and gentle eyes rendered in oils gone dark with age. His gaze fixed on some point beyond the painter's shoulder. No nameplate remained beneath it. Whatever brass had once identified him had long since been removed, leaving only 4 small screw holes in the frame, like a wound that had healed over. She lit a single lamp against the gathering dusk and set about her task, sweeping shards of glass into a dustpan, dragging the sodden ledgers away from the spreading pool of rainwater on the old reading table beneath the window. It was in moving that stack of ledgers, heavy leather-bound account books no one had opened in decades, that Margaret's hand brushed against something tucked beneath the table's false bottom. A seam in the wood, barely visible beneath years of grime, sprung loose the moment her fingers pressed against it, a compartment so cleverly built into the furniture that she might easily have missed it entirely had the water not warped the timber just enough to spring the catch. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with a ribbon long faded from what might once have been blue, and a small leather journal whose cover bore, in gold lettering nearly worn away, the initials C.A. Charles Ashworth. The Duke's own initials. She did not know then that these were not the Duke's letters at all, but his late brother's, the eldest brother, a man named Henry Ashworth, whom she had never once heard mentioned in 3 years beneath that roof, and whose existence, she would soon discover, had been erased from the family's spoken history as thoroughly as if he had never been born. She sat down upon the dusty floor of that abandoned library, rain still ticking softly through the broken pane above her, and began to read. The journal began, innocently enough, as the diary of a young man very much in love. Henry Ashworth, eldest son of the 6th Duke, and thus heir to everything Charles now held, had written, in the year 1841, of a woman named Elizabeth Grey. Not a woman of rank. The daughter, in fact, of a shipwright in Portsmouth, a woman Henry had met while recovering from an illness at a coastal house the family kept for its healthful heir. He wrote of her with a tenderness that made Margaret's chest ache to read it, of long walks along harbour walls, of letters exchanged in secret, of a love that he knew, even as he described it, could never be spoken of openly in the world he had been born into. But the letters told what the journal alone could not, that Henry and Elizabeth had married. Quietly, in a small parish church outside Portsmouth, in the autumn of 1842, a marriage witnessed by a curate and a fisherman, entirely unknown to the 6th Duke, who would surely have disowned his heir for marrying so far beneath his station. She did not know then that this marriage was entirely legal, entirely binding, and entirely capable, had it ever come to light, of producing an heir with a claim to the dukedom that would supersede everything Charles or Edmund believed themselves entitled to. The letters grew more urgent as they went on. Henry wrote of his father's failing health, of his fear of confessing the marriage before the old Duke died, of his plan to wait, just a little longer, until he held the title himself and could not be overruled. Elizabeth's letters, in return, spoke of a child, a son born in the spring of 1843, whom they had named Thomas. And then, abruptly, the correspondence stopped. The final letter in the bundle was not from Henry or Elizabeth at all, but from a solicitor in Portsmouth, addressed to Henry, dated the winter of 1843. It informed him, with the cold formality of legal correspondence, that his wife had died of a fever, and that the child, the infant Thomas, had been placed, at the request of the family, into the care of a woman in a neighbouring parish, to be raised without knowledge of his true parentage. There was one more thing tucked into the bundle. Not a letter at all, but a small, folded note in a different hand entirely, unsigned, unaddressed, written in the careful, uneven script of someone unaccustomed to writing letters at all. It read simply, "The child is safe and loved. He does not know, and by God's mercy never will, what was taken from him. Forgive an old woman for choosing silence." Margaret would learn, much later, that this note had been written by the very housekeeper who had raised the infant Thomas in that neighbouring parish, a woman long dead by the time Margaret found her words, but whose small act of conscience, tucking that note into the bundle rather than destroying it outright, had left the one thread that made everything that followed possible. Margaret sat very still for a long time after reading that letter, because she understood, with a slow and terrible clarity, what it meant. Henry Ashworth had never renounced his marriage. He had simply died, thrown from his horse in the spring of 1844, before he ever became Duke, before he ever reclaimed his son. And someone in that family, someone with the power to arrange such things quietly, had made certain that the boy vanished into obscurity, that the marriage was buried in a locked room, and that the succession passed cleanly to the second son, Charles, as though Henry's love and Henry's wife and Henry's child had never existed at all. She did not know then that the woman who arranged it, the boy's own grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, had done so not out of cruelty alone, but out of a desperate belief that she was protecting the family name from a scandal she could not bear to see attached to it. Every villain, Margaret would come to learn, believes himself the hero of some private, unspoken story. It took her 3 days to decide what to do with what she had found. She told no one at first, not out of scheming, but out of fear. She understood, even in her innocence, that letters like these were not merely sad family history. They were dangerous. If Thomas Ashworth, the vanished infant, still lived, if he had grown to manhood somewhere in England, unaware of the blood in his veins, then he, not Edmund, was the rightful heir to the dukedom of Rothermere, and there were men in that house who would do a great deal to ensure such a man was never found. No one in the household knew that Margaret had found the letters. But someone, it seemed, suspected that something in the east wing had been disturbed. It was Edmund who noticed first, a broken lock on the library door, replaced too neatly, dust disturbed on the spiral stair. He said nothing to Margaret directly, but she began to feel his attention on her at dinner, a new and careful watchfulness where before there had been only condescension. And one evening, returning from a walk in the gardens, she found her own chamber subtly rearranged, a drawer not quite as she had left it. Her small writing desk shifted an inch from its usual place against the wall. She did not know then that Edmund had already begun making inquiries of his own quiet letters to Portsmouth, to old parish registers, to a solicitor's office that had closed its doors decades before. He was not searching, as Margaret was, for justice. He was searching to be certain that whatever had once threatened his inheritance was well and truly buried, and to bury it deeper still if it was not. It was Mrs. Pruitt, in the end, who gave her the courage to speak at all. Margaret had gone to the housekeeper's small parlour one evening, ostensibly to return a mended shawl, but in truth, because she could no longer carry the weight of what she had read without confiding in someone. Mrs. Pruitt had been at Ashcombe Hall since she was a girl of 14, had served under the 6th Duke as a scullery maid before rising, over 40 years, to the position she now held, and Margaret had long suspected that the old woman knew more of the house's history than she ever permitted herself to say. When Margaret asked her, carefully, whether she remembered a young man named Henry, something shifted in Mrs. Pruitt's weathered face, a flicker of old grief, quickly composed. "I was 16 when Master Henry died," she said quietly, setting down her needlework. "A finer young man never walked these halls, miss, whatever they've let you believe of this family since. There was talk, in my day, of a woman he loved beyond his station, and of a child besides. Though we were none of us fool enough to speak such talk above a whisper. The old Duchess had a way of making people disappear from a house without ever raising her voice. I have thought of that boy every year of my life since, wondering what became of him, and never once dared ask." She did not know then that Mrs. Pruitt's quiet confirmation offered not as evidence, but as an old woman's long-buried grief, finally spoken aloud, would give Margaret the courage, the very next morning, to do what she had spent 3 days too frightened to attempt. It was the Duke himself, dying, and perhaps for that reason finally honest, who changed the course of everything. He summoned Margaret to his study on a grey November morning and asked her, without preamble, whether she had found anything of interest in the East Library. She considered lying. She decided, in the end, that she owed this weary, failing man the truth, whatever it might cost her. "I found letters, Your Grace," she said, "belonging to your brother Henry." The Duke closed his eyes. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Margaret feared she had delivered a mortal blow to a man already dying. But when he opened his eyes again, there was something in them she had not expected to see. Relief. "I have waited 20 years," he said quietly, "for someone honest enough to find them." He rose, with some difficulty, and moved to the window of his study, looking out over the same grey gardens Margaret had watched from the breakfast table on the morning her uncle had dismissed her so easily. The rain had not let up in days, and it streaked the glass now in long, unbroken lines, as though the whole house wept quietly along with him. "I was 16 when Henry died," he said. "Old enough to know something was wrong, too young to be told what. My mother forbade his name spoken in this house within a fortnight of the funeral. I remember asking a housemaid once, I could not have been more than 17, whether my brother had left a wife behind him, for I had overheard something of the sort in the stable yard. She went white as chalk and told me I had imagined it, and 2 days later she was dismissed from service without a character. I understood, after that the question itself was dangerous, and I was young enough and comfortable enough to let it go unasked." He turned back to face her, and there was something in his expression Margaret had never seen there before. Not the cool authority of a duke, but the plain, unguarded grief of a man who had spent 30 years quietly ashamed of his own silence. "I told myself, for years, that there was nothing to be done. That Henry's boy, if he lived at all, was better left in ignorance of a birthright that would only unsettle a life he had already built elsewhere. It is a comfortable lie, Margaret, to tell yourself that inaction is mercy. I have had a great deal of time, these last months, to recognize it for the cowardice it truly was." What Charles Ashworth told her that morning, in a voice grown thin with illness, was a story he had carried alone for 2 decades. He had been 16 when his brother Henry died. He remembered, faintly, a servant's whispered talk of a secret marriage, of a child sent away, rumours his mother, the Dowager Duchess, had crushed with such ferocity that even to speak of them in the house became a kind of unspoken crime. By the time Charles was old enough to understand what had truly happened, his mother was dead, the trail to the child was cold, and Charles himself had inherited a title he had never fully believed was rightfully his. He had searched, in his own quiet way, over the years. A letter here, a discreet inquiry there. But he had found nothing, no trace of a boy named Thomas, sent away to be raised under another name in a world that had no idea what blood ran in him. "I am dying, Margaret," the Duke said, and it was the first time in 3 years he had called her by her given name rather than the girl or my niece out of politeness. "And I cannot go to my grave having let my brother's son disappear from history because my mother was ashamed of who he loved." He did not know then, nor did Margaret, that the boy Thomas had grown into a man of nearly 50, a respected physician in the town of Winchester, entirely unaware that the surname he carried, given to him by adoptive parents who had loved him well, was not his true one at all. He did not know that he had spent his whole life believing himself the son of a country apothecary, when in truth he was the last legitimate heir of a ducal line older than the crown itself. The Duke asked Margaret, not commanded, asked, in the voice of a man with no strength left for commands, to find him, to finish what he no longer had the time or health to complete. She did not know then that Edmund, listening at the study door, with the particular skill of a man long practiced in guarding his own interests, had heard every word of that confession. What followed was, in Margaret's later recollection, the most frightening month of her life. She travelled, with the Duke's blessing, and a small purse of his money, and a letter bearing his seal to open doors that might otherwise have remained closed to a young woman travelling alone, first to Portsmouth, to the parish where Henry and Elizabeth had married in secret. The old church still stood, though the curate who had witnessed the ceremony had long since died. But church records, unlike memories, do not fade, and there, in a register gone brittle with age, she found the entry, Henry Charles Ashworth, bachelor, to Elizabeth Mary Grey, spinster, October the 14th, 1842. She did not know then that Edmund had left for Portsmouth only 2 days behind her, carrying letters of his own, letters intended not to confirm the marriage, but to purchase the silence of anyone who might confirm it. From Portsmouth she travelled on to the small parish where the infant Thomas had been placed, following a trail of old parish poor relief records and the fading memory of a housekeeper's granddaughter, who recalled her own grandmother once speaking of a baby brought to them from a grand family, though we were never to say so. The trail led, after nearly 3 weeks of careful, exhausting inquiry, to Winchester, to a modest but respected house on a quiet street, where a physician named Dr. Thomas Gray received his patients each morning with the same steady, unhurried kindness his mother had shown all those years before on the harbour walks of Portsmouth. She did not know, when she first knocked upon his door, that this man, this stranger, this doctor, with kind eyes and his mother's fair hair gone grey at the temples, was the rightful Duke of Rothermere, and had been, unknowingly, for nearly 40 years. Dr. Gray received her in a small consulting room lined with medical texts rather than family portraits, a fire burning low in the grate, a kettle just beginning to sing on its stand. He mistook her at first for a patient, a common enough error, given the lateness of the hour and the evident weariness in her face after so many weeks of travel, and it was only when she asked, quite carefully, whether his mother's name had been Elizabeth, and whether she had died when he was still an infant, that his easy professional manner faltered. "How do you know my mother's name?" he asked her, and there was something guarded now beneath the kindness, the wariness of a man who had spent a lifetime being asked careful, probing questions by people who wanted something from him. She did not rush her answer. She had promised herself, on the long coach journey from Portsmouth, that she would not deliver this news carelessly, whatever it cost her in time. She told him, slowly, of an abandoned library and a false-bottomed table, of a young man named Henry Ashworth who had loved a shipwright's daughter more than he had loved the title waiting for him, of a marriage kept secret and a child sent quietly away when both his parents could no longer keep him. Dr. Gray said nothing for a long while. He set down the cup of tea he had poured for her, untouched, and stared into the fire as though it might offer some correction to what he had just heard. "I was told my mother died of a fever when I was an infant," he said finally, "and that my father had died before I was born. I was raised to believe I was the son of a country apothecary who could not manage a second child alongside his first, and who arranged for my adoption out of simple necessity. I have believed that story for 46 years, madam. You will forgive me if I do not discard it easily for a stranger's account of an old family's secrets." "I would not ask you to discard it easily," Margaret answered him, "only to read what I have brought you, and judge for yourself. But the truth hidden inside those old letters was far more dangerous than even she understood, because Edmund, arriving in Winchester only a day after her, had not come to confirm Thomas Gray's identity out of honesty. He had come to make certain the man never learned it at all. It happened on a bridge over the River Itchen, in the pale light of a Winchester evening, that Margaret first understood the full extent of what Edmund Ashworth was prepared to do. She had gone to walk and gather her thoughts before returning to Dr. Gray's house the following morning with the letters that would change his life entirely, and it was there, on that quiet stone bridge, that Edmund found her. He did not shout. He did not threaten her outright. He was, in his own cold way, almost gentle, which frightened her more than any raised voice could have done. "You do not understand what you are unravelling," he told her. "A title is not merely land and money, Margaret. It is order. It is the structure upon which hundreds of tenant families, hundreds of servants, an entire way of life depends. You would hand all of that to a country physician who has never held a ledger of an estate in his life, merely because an old letter tells you it is his blood right?" She did not know then that Edmund half believed his own justification, that beneath the greed and the gambling debts lay a genuine, if twisted, conviction that he alone understood how to properly steward what Rothermere represented, and that men like Thomas Gray, however innocent, were simply not equipped for the burden of it. "It is not for you or me to decide who deserves it," Margaret answered him, her voice steadier than she felt. "It was decided the day Henry Ashworth married Elizabeth Gray. The law does not ask what is convenient, only what is true." Edmund's expression, in the fading light, went very still. The evening had grown colder while they spoke, and the last light was fading from the water below them, turning the river the colour of old pewter. A pair of swans drifted beneath the bridge, indifferent to the quiet war being waged above them. "You speak of order," Margaret said, "but what you protect is not order, it is convenience. It was convenient, 20 years ago, for a grieving mother to erase her own grandson rather than face the scandal of his birth. It is convenient now for you that a country physician remain ignorant of who he is, so that his ignorance may become your inheritance. I have watched this family call itself noble for 3 years, sir, while quietly deciding whose existence is inconvenient enough to bury. I will not help bury another." Edmund's jaw tightened. For a moment, something almost like shame passed across his face, quickly smothered, as such things always were in him, beneath the colder mask he had worn since childhood, since the day he had first understood that his brother would inherit everything, and he would inherit nothing at all. "Do you imagine," he said, his voice dropping lower, "that I asked to be born second? That I asked to spend my life watching Charles receive every honour, every deference, every acre of land, while I was left to manage his accounts like a glorified clerk? I have spent 30 years being told to wait my turn, Margaret, and now that my turn has very nearly come, you would hand it instead to a stranger who has never once set foot on this estate, who would not know a tenant's grievance from a groundskeeper's excuse." "Then perhaps," Margaret said quietly, "that is precisely why it should not be yours either." "Then you leave me no choice," he said quietly, "but to see that the truth is never proven." He did not know then that the housekeeper's granddaughter in the small parish had already made a sworn copy of the poor relief records before Margaret ever left, a precaution Margaret herself had insisted upon, some quiet instinct warning her that proof, once found, could just as easily be lost again. And he did not know that the Duke, in his final failing weeks, had already written a letter of his own, a full and formal confession, witnessed and sealed, delivered by private courier to the family's own solicitors in London, the very week Margaret departed for Portsmouth. Edmund believed the truth lived only in the letters Margaret carried, and that a single act of destruction, a fire, a theft, an unfortunate accident on a lonely road might yet bury Henry Ashworth's son a second time. He was wrong, and it was that single miscalculation that would, within the month, undo him entirely. Margaret returned to Ashcombe Hall in early December with Dr. Thomas Gray at her side, a man still reeling from a truth he had not asked for, and had not, at first, wished to believe. He had listened to her, in his quiet consulting room in Winchester, with the careful patience of a physician accustomed to delivering difficult diagnoses and receiving them in turn. He had read his mother's letters with tears he did not attempt to hide. And when Margaret asked him, gently, whether he wished to pursue what was rightfully his, he had given an answer that told her everything she needed to know about the kind of duke he would become, if he chose to become one at all. "I have spent my whole life caring for people who had nothing," he said. "I do not know if I want a title. But I think I owe it to my mother, and to the father I never knew, to at least know the truth of who I am." They arrived at Ashcombe Hall to find the Duke gravely weakened, but alive enough to receive his brother's son at last, alive enough to weep openly at the sight of Henry's fair hair and gentle bearing echoed so plainly in the face of a stranger. and alive enough, crucially, to formally acknowledge him before witnesses, before solicitors, before the full weight of English law. Edmund did not go quietly. He produced, in a final desperate attempt, a claim that the church register itself had been tampered with, an accusation so brazen and so quickly disproven by the sworn copy Margaret had thought to secure weeks earlier, that it succeeded only in revealing the full shape of his own scheming to the family's solicitors and to the Duke himself. She did not know then that Edmund's gambling debts, once exposed alongside his attempted deception, would ruin what little reputation he had left in society far more thoroughly than any honest confession of a lost inheritance ever could have. Men who might have forgiven a desperate brother rarely forgive a dishonest one. The Duke of Rothermere died in the last week of January, 6 weeks after acknowledging Thomas Grey as his brother's legitimate son and heir. He died, those who attended him said, more peacefully than anyone had seen him in years. A man who had finally set down a burden he had carried, silently, since he was 16 years old. Thomas Grey became, in time, the 8th Duke of Rothermere, though he kept his surgery in Winchester for another 2 years, before finally, gently, allowing his new responsibilities to claim the whole of his attention. He proved, in the end, exactly the kind of steward Edmund had once claimed he could never be: careful with the tenants, honest with the accounts, and entirely without the cold ambition that had curdled in his cousin's heart. He visited the sick among his tenant farmers with the same unhurried attention he had once given his patients in Winchester, and it was said, within a year of his taking the title, that no family on the Rothermere estate went without a doctor's care again, whatever their means. He commissioned, as one of his first acts, the restoration of his father's portrait, the very painting Margaret had found hanging crooked and unnamed above the library fireplace, and had a new brass plate fixed beneath it, bearing at last the name that had been stripped away 20 years before: Henry Charles Ashworth, beloved son and brother. He hung beside it a smaller portrait, commissioned from an old miniature the solicitor's office had kept among Elizabeth Grey's effects, so that mother and father might look out, together, over the room where their son's existence had very nearly been erased for good. And Margaret, who had been told, not 1 year before, that she was of no more use to the house than the dust on its windowsills, Margaret was given, at the new Duke's own insistence, a settlement that made her independent for the whole of her life, and something she had wanted far more than money: a permanent place in the restored East Library, cataloguing and preserving the very letters that had once been hidden beneath a false-bottomed table, so that no Ashworth descendant would ever again grow up not knowing the truth of where they came from. She did not marry for another 4 years, and when she did, it was to a country solicitor named James Whitfield, who had assisted quietly in the legal proceedings that restored Thomas Grey's inheritance, and who had watched, with growing admiration, the patient courage of a young woman who had uncovered a 20-year injustice, not through cunning or ambition, but through honesty, and a refusal to look away from an uncomfortable truth simply because it was easier to leave it buried. Years later, she would understand that the moment her uncle dismissed that library as a room nobody wanted was, in truth, the moment her entire life changed. That some of the most important rooms in our lives are the ones we are told hold nothing worth finding. If you stand today in the east wing of what is now called Ashcombe Hall, you will find the library restored, its shelves dusted, its broken window long since mended, its old reading table repaired, false bottom and all, and kept as a quiet reminder of what was once hidden inside it. There is a small brass plaque near the door, placed there by the 8th Duke himself, bearing no grand inscription, only a single line, taken from his mother's final letter to his father, all those decades before: "Love does not vanish simply because it is inconvenient to remember." Margaret Ashworth Whitfield lived to see her own grandchildren visit that library, and she would tell them. When they asked why such an ordinary room seemed to matter so much to her, that it was not the room at all that mattered. It was what she had chosen to do, once she had found what others had wished to forget. If this story moved you, do not forget to subscribe before you go, so the next forgotten chapter of English aristocratic history finds its way to you. And do leave a comment below telling me where in the world you watched this from. It means more than you know to hear from every corner of the globe, listening to these old, quiet stories of letters, libraries, and the truths that refuse to stay buried.